Right, welcome everyone again to just say hello, post the recording button being pressed. It is absolutely my honor and my privilege to be hosting Professor Michael Stein today. For the purpose of his introduction, I would like to share that Professor Michael Ashley Stein is the co-founder and executive director of the Harvard Law School Project on Disability and a visiting professor at Harvard Law School since 2005. Considered one of the world's leading experts on disability law and policy, Professor Stein participated in the drafting of the UN CRPD, works with with disabled people's organizations and non-governmental organizations around the world, and actively consults with governments on their disability laws and policies. Professor Stein teaches at Harvard Law School and the Harvard E. Kennedy School of Governments and holds an extraordinary professorship at the University of Pretoria Center for Human Rights. He earned a JD from Harvard Law School, becoming the first known person with a disability to be a member of the Harvard Law Review, and a PhD from the Cambridge University. Professor Stein was also appointed by President Obama to the US Holocaust Memorial Council. And that is quite an introduction. And I would like to thank and hand over to Professor Stein to go ahead with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you ever so much for having me. Today will be a general sort of introduction to the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, CRPD. But I'm happy to get as granular as you like. In the question and answer period. I'm also happy, as I've mentioned to Sandra and to Charlene, to come back at some time and to focus more deeply on any particular issues, especially mental health, which is one of the areas in which I try to be useful. So thank you one and all for coming. The CRPD, to give you the short version, if you want your takeaways, I don't work with PowerPoint, but if you wish your takeaways, the short version is it's the first human rights treaty of the 21st century. It's the first international binding treaty that expressly goes to the rights of persons with disabilities in an enforceable hard law manner, as we use the term. It is the treaty that changed the way that the UN runs negotiations with civil society, nothing about us without us, so that now stakeholders actively participate in the development of their treaties. It is the fastest negotiated UN human rights treaty. It's the fastest ratified UN human rights treaty. We're not quite at universal ratification, and the US undoubtedly will continue to manifest its exceptionalism to UN human rights treaties. But it says something that the speed of the negotiations were there. It created a participatory dynamic, which is what my co-author and good friend Janet Lord and I like to say, in that people with disabilities were not only included in the negotiations, but as part of the treaty text and the rights under the treaty, it is absolutely incumbent on states to ensure the meaningful participation of people with disabilities. The outcomes of the treaty, again, in very short version, giving you the takeaways up front, so that I can pontificate for a bit afterwards, are that it has changed the legal reforms around the world. It's the historically largest law reform project in the world relating to disability law. It has changed the way that the UN and international systems engage with people with disabilities. We were excluded from most of the UN work. Now disability is central to all the UN work. It has changed the development world so that the World Bank and bilaterals now must include people with disabilities and disability rights in their work, which is something new and different and probably has the greatest effect on the daily lives of people with disabilities. And finally, it's changed the outlook of people with disabilities. Nothing about us without us. The disability global rights movement has now become empowered and feels that they belong at the table and they need to be heard. And that was a big change. So those are your big takeaways. Here's some of the background to it. Circa the millennium, 2001, people with disabilities were not included in international programming at the UN level. If you don't believe me, then read the report by my good friend Gerard Quinn, who just stepped down as Special Rapporteur on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or Teresa Degner, who at one point was the chair of the CRPD committee. As of 2001, the largest international scheme was the Millennium Development Goals, around from 2000 to 2015, and the D word does not appear in the goals or the targets or the indicators. So despite pointing out that 70 million children around the world were not in school, nothing about the 1/3 of them who happen to be kids with disabilities. The fact that they wanted to have world poverty over the MDG period, and that people with disabilities had a poverty prevalence rate twice that of their population rate, and the D word did not appear. The treaty bodies themselves, those who sit and monitor the human rights work in Geneva, did not receive complaints relating to disability, despite the fact that the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there are indeed children with disabilities. The CEDAW, the Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, there are, of course, women with disabilities, and yet the UN treaty bodies were not doing anything about that. And so there was a movement to try to get a disability-specific human rights treaty at the General Assembly. It had failed in the late 80s in 2 attempts because the UN pushed back and said they were treaty fatigued. They were treated out, as you like. They had just finished the Children's Convention. They had finished the Women's Convention. They were thinking about migrants and others, and they just didn't want to get involved in another treaty. And so there were soft laws, non-binding things like the World Program of Action, the standard rules for the equalization of persons with disabilities, good things, step forward, but not the same as a binding human rights treaty. In 2001, in addition to this academic push by Professor Gerard Quinn and Professor Teresa Degner and the report they wrote for the UN High Commissioner, Mary Robinson, there was also the politics that were involved, which was the government of Mexico became a champion at the General Assembly, and then afterwards during the negotiations of disability rights. This is an interesting phenomenon that you see at the UN and other international venues. Countries that you may not necessarily think of as champions of particular causes, countries that you may not think of as being particularly adept at implementing these causes at home, become prominent on the stage. Here it was because Vicente Fox was running for president of Mexico. In order to receive his party's nomination, he brokered a deal with someone who had a disability and was moving out of the way for Fox to get the presidentship nomination. And in return, he promised to champion a disability rights treaty, and he did. If you look at the arc of when we began negotiations in 2001 until the treaty was adopted in December of 2006, that is the arc of the Mexican government under Vicente Fox. Not a coincidence. But in addition, China has always been extraordinarily prominent and loud and helpful regarding disability rights on the international level. We can discuss what you think or don't think about them at the domestic level, but they were there pushing as well. So the developing world, the global south, if you like, these are heuristics and no doubt will peeve some people, but I'm trying to use proxies. We're actually champions of disability rights at the General Assembly level. The General Assembly did not give a mandate to go forth and negotiate a treaty, much like in parentheses, the Human Rights Council has now given us a mandate to negotiate an older persons treaty, which I'm privileged to work on as well, close parentheses, but instead said, we're going to authorize an ad hoc committee in New York for 2 weeks at a time, and you can negotiate whether you think there ought to be a convention. They appointed Ambassador Luis Gallegos of Ecuador to be the chair of the commission. The reason they appointed Luis was because the UN works in cycles of regions, and at this point it was Latin America and the Caribbean whose turn it was to chair the next big initiative that came out of the General Assembly. And although Ecuador is a small mission to the UN, it's a low middle income country. It doesn't have a lot of resources, which means it doesn't have a lot of staff in New York. Ambassador Gallegos was extremely well thought of, and he agreed to do it despite his other commitments. Ecuador was also a very fortunate choice, and Luis especially a fortunate choice, because one, he's a terrific human rights lawyer generally, and two, Ecuador has a tradition of being human rights inclined. So, although it's more in the line of what used to be Venezuela than, say, in the line of thinking of what perhaps used to be the United States, they were inclined to think about human rights. At the time, the vice president was a wheelchair user. He eventually became the president of the country. He eventually became the UN Special Envoy on Disability. So Luis was keen on disability rights and knew about nothing about us without us. And so one of the first things that happened during these ad hoc sessions, before we even began, was that Ambassador Gallegos, as chair of the negotiations, utilized the ECOSOC, it's a UN agency, device whereby non-governmental organizations, civil society organizations, could attend. And not only could they attend the negotiations, they could intervene. He declared a rule for the negotiations that civil societies could intervene. This is different than what used to occur at the UN. So at the first of these 8 ad hoc sessions, there were 85 individuals with disabilities who were not state representatives, not sitting on state bureaus, who came and participated. By the 9th ad hoc session, which was only half a day, it was a rubber stamp of the treaty text itself, there were over 850 people with disabilities and their representative organizations attending. Nothing about us without us, really, in action. So this was dramatic. The ad hoc sessions, if you want a little bit quickly on how the UN works, generally sessions work from 10 to 1 and from 3 to 6. Between 1 and 3, there are side sessions, and these are technical information. These are learning sessions where civil society or long-winded academics can come and talk about what their technical expertise is and work through issues so that both civil society and states representatives can hear what we think about things like what's a reasonable accommodation, or what happens after this treaty is negotiated, or what do we do about sharing of resources or technical knowledge or expertise. What was different about this UN treaty and its negotiation is that because of the ECOSOC signing in, that Ambassador Gallegos not only allowed but enabled, we had all these people with disabilities there, and we developed an international disability caucus, which nowadays is referred to as the International Disability Alliance. That was the successor to the International Disability Caucus. It's its origin, if you'd like to know that. And we would meet from 8 to 10 every morning before the formal negotiations. And during those sessions, we would have, just like any intra-group meeting, we would decide what we, as the world's voice for the 1.3 billion people with disabilities, want out of the articles that would be negotiated that day. So in 2 hours, we had robust discussions, screaming, crying, hair pulling, much like any other intra-group meeting or maybe your family dinners, I'm not sure. And often it was bitter, and sometimes it was easy. And there were always considerations and attention and difficulties with ensuring that we were representative enough of the large, diverse world of people with disabilities. I put together an intellectual disability sub-caucus to ensure that their voices were heard. Interestingly, I just want to note, as far as this IDC, one of the most prominent members was Tina Minkowitz from the World Network of Users and Survivors of Psychiatry. So contrary to the typical or historical history of people with psychosocial disabilities being excluded even from the global disability rights movement, here mental health and the issues presented by Tina and colleagues were actually prominent. And that was in part due to her extraordinary advocacy. I did not agree with everything that she's done. I still do not. But the fact that she was able to push the ball so much on issues relating to mental health, equal rights, equal representation before the law really speaks to how effective she was and is and remains as an advocate. So all credit to her. At the end of this 2 hour session, and I got to referee a few of them, and say referee rather than moderate, we had this, piece of paper that indicated what the world's disability rights movement wanted from those articles that were going to be discussed on that day. This is a lesson for you on advocacy, and I've worked in 40-something countries around the world, and it's true in all of them. If you can speak with one voice, if you can give government ministers and others one vision of what their disability community wants and needs, it is much more effective than having the splintered fraternal arguments, one against the other, putting deaf needs ahead of blind needs, putting them ahead of wheelchair needs, etc. Better to think about how to expand the pie than how to cut the pie up. So we would come out with one statement, one page, and we would hand that out to the states during the negotiations. Well, what happened in the formal negotiations and what happened in the informal negotiations? During the formal negotiations, we would be in this extraordinarily large room, conference room 4, which still exists, although the UN has been spiffied up a bit since its inaccessible days when we negotiated a disability rights treaty. Feel free to ask about that. I have good stories about it as well. And in the formal negotiations, you would be sitting in this large conference room. Ambassador Gallegos and the Bureau would be sitting at the front of the room on an inaccessible dais. Took them quite a while to figure out to put a ramp up to it. There would be screens behind them, which would project the text of the article or articles that we were discussing on that day. These were not provided to anyone in alternative formats or accessible formats. In addition, the dailies, the summaries of what went on at the UN that day, were also not provided in accessible formats. Various NGOs, including for a while the World Reform Judaism Network, provided accessible dailies. After that, there were people with disabilities who were not mobility challenged, sitting on one side of this big room on the stairs. Blind people needed to bring friends if they wanted audio descriptions of what was going on. Deaf and hard of hearing people had to bring friends or interpreters because they were not provided if they wanted to know simultaneously what was going on. Those of us who were wheelchair users sat at the back of the room. I was privileged to sit with the most marvelous group of advocates, my sisters in disability rights, all women, the late great Judy Heumann, the wonderful Charlotte McLean and Schlappo, who I saw last week, then representing the world's human rights commissions. Now she's at the World Bank. Venus Alagan, then Secretary General of Disabled Peoples International, was Angela Berman-Bieler, who came from the International Disability Development Consortium. We sat in the back, and the room was not accessible. So another interesting facet about it. Different states brought different people with disabilities with them, if they brought them at all. Japan and Korea prominently brought about 20 or 30 during the sessions, and made for quite a robust representation. But other states would sometimes bring a disability rights advocate to sit with them at their seats in this conference room. So prominently, Rosemary Case, who eventually became a CRPD vice chair, was there from Australia and sitting with the Australian delegation and able to make interventions on behalf of the state of Australia. But then other states brought people who had disabilities who really were not disability rights advocates and were there to represent the state's views. that was sometimes a little confusing. Okay, so what went on during the informal negotiations? I mentioned formal. So formal would be you would sit there as the government of Lesotho or whatever, and when you wanted to make an intervention, you put up your placard. Now it's all digital, and they would call on you, and you would say something extremely boring and technical, such as in Article 3, second sentence, I believe that we can conflate those two terms because they're nearly identical. All this is important. I say this as a law professor and as an international human rights lawyer. But what was more effective and more important were the informal negotiations. These happened anywhere and everywhere. They happened in structured settings, such as the Mexican mission had many meetings that it hosted where you would try to put together states that disagreed on a particular issue or try to create solidarity among other states who would follow what it is that you were advocating. And with enough tequila, you get a little more compliance. But also in the hallways of the UN, and even stopping people, states representatives and others on the way to the restrooms. In the whole UN system at the time, there were 2 accessible restrooms. And we talk about nothing about us without us and why we all know each other. 850 people, 2 restrooms. We actually know each other. So you would stop states representatives and say, your intervention really interested me. I wonder if we could discuss it afterwards, of course. And so these informal negotiations are really where you hammered out ideas that are unclear, and when you work through philosophies and such. Again, the side sessions in the middle were on technical assistance, and I was privileged to do lots of those. At the end of the 10 to 1 and 3 to 6 sessions, someone from the disability rights community got to speak. And they would present views. And really, this was education for the state's representatives. Because consider the people who are at the United Nations, even from low and middle income countries, are the elite from their countries. They go to fancy schools like Harvard, Yale, Oxford, whatever. They live in very fancy places. They have the money and the means by which to be high-level diplomats. And that means that most of the time that they come across people with disabilities, if at all, is they see them begging on street corners. They're not having them over to their houses for dinner or for tea. And they don't know about the group. And very often they don't have mandates from their home states, from their home foreign offices on what to do. Sometimes they do have mandates, but most of the time they don't. And so having someone from the Disability Caucus speaking about what it was like, this was William, may he rest in peace, from Ireland, what it was like to have been forcibly placed into a psychiatric institution and to have lived there for a number of years, what it was like to have seen friends and people at this institution who had been there for decades, what it was like to be released from the institution and not have community support, and the struggle to integrate back into society after this forced absence. This was very affecting in all the right ways. So these interventions were enormously helpful. On a slightly lighter note, Robert Martin, who became Sir Robert Martin from New Zealand, an individual with an intellectual disability, he became the first and only expert to sit on any UN treaty body, and he passed away also. May he rest in peace. Robert talked about legal capacity in a different way. He said that growing up in New Zealand, he was in an institution. He wasn't allowed to handle his own finances. After moving into the community, he did have his own finances. He has his own bank account. And he said, I've never actually written a bad check. I've never bounced a bad check. And he said, but here we are in America, and down in Houston, there's this company called Enron that just lost $3 billion. So why am I not allowed to handle my own money when these companies can lose billions of dollars? And it was said with humor, but there's a lot of truth in it. So these were really educative. These were really a chance for educating the states on it. And although the states would make their interventions, sometimes you wound up with unknown allies. So Gerard Quinn and I were sitting behind one of the representatives from a Gulf state. I won't identify which one. And he told us that he'd like to do something to help us. He had no instructions from his home office. What could he do? So Gerard and I actually wrote out an intervention for him, and he read it as if it was, his own words. So you wind up as well with unknown and unknowable allies. So what happened in the substance and process of these negotiations? The first ad hoc session was should we have a human rights treaty? Because the mandate was not to draft one. The mandate was to figure out if we needed one. And every country in the world was supportive of it, other than the United States, which did not outright resist it, but basically said, we have everything we need in the US. We're number one. We're number one. Exceptionalism. We won't block you, but we're not going to help you. And until the seventh of the ad hoc sessions, the US did not have a head of delegation. So there were some extraordinary people, both Democrats and Republicans, who were present in the room and who offered informally a lot of really good technical assistance, but they were not allowed to speak from the floor of the UN in an official capacity. They were not allowed to provide a side session. So we had the head of the Department of Justice, Americans with Disabilities Act, Disability Division, John Wodach, who had 20 years of enforcing the ADA and was not allowed to actually make a formal input on what a reasonable accommodation is or what some of the challenges involved were. That was embarrassing and troubling. Please feel free to ask afterwards about that if you like. The second ad hoc session, we had already decided we would have a human rights treaty, and the question is, would it be more of a civil political rights, human rights, immediately recognizable type of treaty, or would it be more like a social rights, second generation rights, if you like, progressive implementation treaty? And the only country that pushed for the narrower version of civil political rights was the European Union, which as a regional entity has actually acceded now to the CRPD. And they wanted it basically to look like the Framework Directive on Employment, very civil political rights, very narrow. We decided to have both. And that follows in the progression of human rights treaties at the UN. The Convention on the Rights of the Child was the most immediate predecessor, and it had evolved somewhat over the CEDAW, the Women's Treaty. The Disability Treaty took this even further in holistic rights. So to just focus on one article in employment, there's both the prohibitions on discrimination, and there is also the requirement to put in progressive measures, such as vocational training or job set-asides. And we could talk about that, but you have both of them at once. And the idea is that this human rights treaty is the most evolved in not thinking about separate forms of rights, but rather thinking about holistic, synergistic types of rights. What else is in the treaty that is of interest or of controversy? Of course, those of you from the psychosocial movement and their friends and supporters, we know that Article 12 on legal capacity was hotly debated. Again, we could do a separate seminar on it. But the bottom line is the version that you see in the treaty text is actually the one that the Disability Caucus was pushing. I have some issues with the text and with the treaty's interpretation of it. And again, we could do a separate seminar on it. But if getting what you want is winning, the disability rights movement won on that account. Note that although the party line was there are no new rights in this treaty, no other group has had to express their rights the way people with disabilities have had to do so. So that Article 12 is an acknowledgement of the way that people with disabilities have been mistreated and excluded, and the need for an article on it. Same thing with independent living because of institutionalization and the effect on disability uniquely as a population. We needed Article 19 to express living in the community, whereas it's just assumed for everyone else. They live in the community. Article 12, though, was quite controversial. There are other rights in the convention that, again, although the party line is no new rights, it's just a basic iteration of existing rights, but expressed in a disability framework, is not really true, for being totally honest. So until the CRPD, there's never been a human rights treaty that said, oh, and intellectual property laws cannot ban people with disabilities from accessing information. Doesn't exist before it. And of course, the outcome from it and what follows from it becomes the Marrakesh Treaty, which, for blind, visually impaired, and print disabled people means access to ebooks and other forms. And South Africa had a very interesting judgment on it at the Constitutional Court, the first one that really touched on disability rights, although some of us tried for decades to try to get a disability rights case before the Constitutional Court. So the treaty has all the basic things that you might like. It's got some tweaks, as we've said, employment, health, etc. Health is about equal access, right? So there's no right to be healthy in the international world. But there is right to equal access. If everybody gets it, people with disabilities get it. But P.S., in parentheses, remember that the provision of reasonable accommodations is very often necessary to make for equal access. So we have, under the general provisions and obligations articles, the need for reasonable accommodations. Also in the non-discrimination provisions, a description of the denial of reasonable accommodations as a form of discrimination. There's a separate article on women and girls with disabilities. That's excellent. There's a separate article on children with disabilities. Missing from the treaty is anything relating to youth. And youth are the future. We just convened a workshop here at Radcliffe on children and youth with disabilities and climate change. And we, of course, made sure we had youth with disabilities present and presenting via video. And youth is not in the treaty. Other things that are not in the treaty, the word indigenous appears only in the preamble, because people with disabilities and indigeneity were funded or had access to the UN funds for the first of the 3 ad hoc sessions, but ran out of money. And so the articles that really could benefit from an indigenous perspective: education. What about modalities for indigenous people and their languages? Social participation and culture, right? The ownership and disposing of property. All these things have different flavors and expressions for First Nations and others, and the indigeneity does not appear in the convention. LGBTQI rights do not appear in the convention because that group, sadly, although hopefully not for too much longer, are excluded from the international realm of human rights. Nothing about us without us, but some of our siblings are not there. So that's not there. There was controversy over sexual reproductive health and rights. We used some of the language from the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, and at one point had a separate article on sexual reproductive rights and health. And that was pushed back against not only by the US when they finally sent a head of delegation, but by the Arab League and by the Vatican representative. They said it could lead to abortion rights. Also, the word gender appeared early on and was eventually removed in favor of the word sex by these same groups, their advocacy being that this could lead to homosexuality. Oh dear, oh dear. So there were some controversial areas in the convention, some controversial NGOs as well. But at the end of the day, we have this convention, and it looks not only like existing conventions, but has those expressions that are particularly related to people with disabilities. There is a committee which, again, the language of who's on the committee looks very much like other treaty bodies. We drafted the proposals for monitoring here between the 5th and the 6th session. Some were adopted, some were not. The monitoring body has some superpowers. which it has used very infrequently or not at all. It goes for adoption to the General Assembly on December 13th, 2006. The General Assembly at that point not accessible to people with mobility impairments. So for myself and for Minyu Kim, who is now the chair of the CRPD committee and uses a big electric chair, we sat on the floor in our chairs of the General Assembly while they were adopting it by consensus. It was the fastest to be ratified, the fastest to be operationalized. The committee itself is comprised until the last election, it's 18 people. Every single one of them, other than 2 people in the last election, were people who themselves have disabilities, and the 2 exceptions are parents of people with disabilities, and they're actually quite formidable allies. There's a tension in the disability movement regarding whether DPOs and can include people without disabilities. And if you read the CRPD committee's general comment on it, I have to say it's a bit disappointing and exclusionary. We need all the allies that we can get. We don't need to be smothered by them, but we need all the allies we can get. Certainly, I could speak for myself. Whatever it is that I am or have done, I would not be here without parents who supported me, and that is true for many people with disabilities around the world. And so what's the best thing to come out about it? Well, as I said earlier, I think the most effective in the day-to-day lives of people with disabilities has been the development realm. So the World Bank loans out like $180 billion a year to various countries. And now all that work is supposed to be disability inclusive. Is it? No. The World Bank has moved from about 6% to about 13%. But think about that times the $180 billion and what that does for buying buses, what that does for employment schemes, what that does for lots of others. That's been amazing progress. I hope by 2030, it's highly more accessible. More likely, it's going to be 2040 or 2050. International aid is now accessible in many places, such as the UK, Australia, and others. Laws have been reformed, not enough. We're seeing some very interesting experimentation on the eradication of guardianship and the insertion of substituted decision making. It's still very much an experiment and very much a work in progress. We could talk about that. We have seen work like by Avis and others is really at the forefront on using peer-to-peer as support. It's not something that's put in a statute, but it's something that's there in practice. We can talk about that as well. And we're seeing DPOs actually taking pride and taking ownership of the convention and asserting their rights and asserting their priorities. It is, although on the one hand, people with disabilities have been excluded from much of the climate policy law and negotiations, at the last COP, finally, there was recognition of a disability constituency, even though disability is in the preamble, in the opening paragraph of the Paris Agreement. So we are seeing this progress. Those MDGs that I mentioned at the beginning, those pass, and then we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and lo and behold, we have 7 mentions specifically of disability and 6 times in which disability appears along with other vulnerable populations in the SDGs. So we are seeing progress. We are seeing disability included in all UN work, despite the quote unquote liquidity challenge, which means that their funding has been cut out from under them. We're seeing disability being prominent. UNICEF is doing some terrific work on including children with disabilities in school and refugee camps and otherwise. So we are seeing a movement forward, not fast enough. I worry about the DPOs that I work with around the world. It's very easy to feel optimistic when you're very privileged. Obviously, I'm very privileged by where I live and what I do. But we are seeing that it's the right direction. So as Martin Luther King said, the arc of justice, right? It's bending. We're bending towards justice. So we have about 15 minutes. I'm happy to take your questions. I don't know, Sandra, if you'd like to moderate or not.
Yeah, with pleasure. I just want to say straight off the bat, kind of thank you. Sure, such a wealth of background history knowledge. Obviously, like you said a number of times, there's so many little avenues you could unpack in its own kind of a seminar. Like a legal capacity to me is something that speaks directly to my areas of interest and things like that. But I am going to open up the floor first to any questions. I do have a couple myself, but I want to first check if anybody else would like to post any questions. Now is your opportunity. There are a couple in the chat, but I'm just going to give it a moment to see if anyone would like to raise their hand or unmute and ask Professor a question.
All right. Well, why don't I take some of the
chat.
questions in the chat? Did the ID subcaucus comprise people with mental disability? No, they were intellectual and developmentally disabled persons. The psychosocial community or mental disability community was quite well mainstreamed within the International Disability Alliance. In fact, as I said, they turned the tables, and good on them, and that they were actually quite prominent. One way that I can illustrate that is that the reason we have such an Article 12 on legal capacity, um, if you like it or don't like it, but it's certainly an extraordinarily assertive version of Article 12, is because there is a brokering between Tina and the psychosocial group. Support us on this, and we'll support you, the blind, the deafblind, and the World Blind Union, on your version of the article on education, which basically has a loophole that would allow particular disability subgroups to opt in to having their own separate schools. Also, a very prominent expression of Braille, sign language, and other modalities. Again, a shame we don't have Indigenous language. So that's an example of another way that the psychosocial group was very prominent and very strong. We have a comment from Carly about expanding the pie rather than cutting it up. But she also notes correctly that we need to be sensitive to specific needs, visions for conditions or disabilities. How do we ensure that down the road they're not, swallowed up or ignored? And I'm paraphrasing you, Carly. My apologies if I'm not as eloquent as you are. That's a tension that exists in disability rights everywhere. The people who oppose disability rights, which is not Carly, actually will say, well, disability is so diverse and has so many needs, we can't possibly handle it, on a meta level. And my response to that is twofold. One is, I am sure that no one would say that the world's 51% female population is all monolithic or univocal, or only has one type of need. I would be shouted out, and rightly so. So the idea that a group is large or diverse, or has large forms of intersectional identities is not a reason not to include them and to engage them as a group. What groups even that large, whether it's sex or whether it's disability, have in common is exclusion based on stigma, based on prejudice. And if we can fight against the prejudice, then afterwards we can get more granular about ensuring that accommodations and inclusion are done on more of a either disability type or disability need sort of view. So that's the way we generally handle the question of how do you include the group as a meta concept but then also ensure that individuals are included and accommodated on their particular needs. If you wanted an analog to that, back when the U.S. Supreme Court still believed in class actions, they used to have class actions based on race and gender, sex put together. And then afterwards, there would be subgroupings on how to engage with those particular groups. So it's been done. It's it is a complex issue, but not an insurmountable issue. The first one is to think about focusing on rebutting the prejudice that exists. Okay, two nice comments. I need to leave now. Okay, thanks for joining us. You appreciate things. Okay, thank you. Thank you as well. Sandra, did you have questions you've been holding in reserve?
I do. I think the main question, so it's something that I encounter quite a lot in obviously the advocacy kind of space. We advocate very much from a human rights framework, specifically, obviously, the UN CRPD. And often the question comes in about, yes, we know many countries have ratified it, but obviously implementation and what it looks like in practice is a bit stalled, if I can use a bit of a diplomatic word. So how do we kind of, as advocates or as people with lived experience, how do we increase the speed or, basically, I'm missing the word here, but how do we support the process of implementation?
It's a wonderful question, and your use of the verb stalled is gentle. It's been resisted or ignored in some places. If we want to be clever, we could say it's been constipated. There are two things. One is, as I mentioned before, speaking with one voice. I've worked in 40-something countries, including with ministers on particular issues. And when they've got the deaf group saying they want one thing, and the blind group saying they want the opposite thing, or something that's not related to it, and don't listen to them, that causes confusion, and they're not sure what to do, even if they were inclined to do more to begin with. So coming up with a national presentation, saying, here's what your country's people with disabilities want, with one voice, is more effective than having the competition, which often permeates different disability groups. That's one. The other is being active, or it's not a real word, but proactive. The idea that although the CRPD obligates under Article 4 governments to reach out and to ensure the meaningful participation of people with disabilities, they often will not do so. And so reaching out to governments saying, hello, we are the umbrella group of people with disabilities in your country. You have the following obligations. We would like to help you help us. Let us help you help us. Let us do meaningful consultations and interactive dialogue. And you lose nothing by doing that, because if they say no or they ignore you, then in your state report to the CRPD committee, you put in the documentation. We reached out. We asked for meaningful participation on the following issues, which are really important to us. They refused to do it, and committee, here's what we would like. So trying to be more cooperative, not waiting. I say rights aren't like rain. You can't sit on the ground and look up at the sky and pray for it and hope it comes. You need to be active as far as seeking your rights. And admittedly, right, in some places that can be more difficult than in others. In some places it can even be dangerous. So it's really up to every local disability community to decide, one, what it is that they want, and two, what relationship they want to foster with their governments.
Thanks, Professor. That's very insightful and very useful. Obviously, just on meaningful engagement, it's something in the space as well that's brought up a lot. And obviously, you've spoken to at here as well quite extensively, specifically people with lived experience of mental health conditions in this context. What does meaningful engagement mean to you? Like, because there's different definitions kind of floating around, and there's an inconsistency, some might say, in the space. So just from your perspective and your experience, because obviously, you know, you've been around what meaningful engagement is, what is that?
Well, you can find an extensive uh, definition by the committee in their general comment, but from my point of view,
Yeah.
it means you're not window dressing, and you're not invited to a session, so that the people who will make the decisions based on their great judgment will maybe listen to you for a bit, and then thank you very much, and off you go. It
Mm.
has to be a continuing relationship of respect and meaningful engagement. Here is what we want. Here's our priorities. Here's why. It's our country. So how are we going to get there? And admittedly, very often there are politicians as opposed to public servants who really just pay lip service and don't really care too much about it. So it's important as well to circle back and to follow up on those things.
Yeah, very, very
And,
valuable.
and easier said than done.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and I have one final question, and then we can maybe bounce it back to the group in case anyone has any last thoughts or comments. So this is where we stand at the moment, obviously, with the UN CRPD. Where do you foresee it in 5, 10, 20 years? Where would you like it to be, and what kind of an impact? That word is used a lot in the space as well, but it's a pertinent term. Where would you like to see human rights, basically, frameworks in the years to come?
Wow, what a question. Frankly and bluntly, I would like to see all development aid be inclusive. And this is from the human rights lawyer. I think that making sure that all buses, HIV schemes, employment works, judicial trainings, etc., are inclusive would do more than all the legal reforms put together. We see here in the US after 35 years of the Americans with Disabilities Act that our employment laws have not done anything. But people with disabilities in 35 years, now can get on the bus and go to the restaurant and sit in the library and go to the cinema and do whatever. And I remember the world that existed before that. That's what's made the most difference in people's lives. What would I like to see from the CRPD besides it being implemented that way? I'd like to see more clarity and consensus on what some of these rights mean, and in particular, I would like to see more attention paid to, again, I'll use the word the global south. And I've written on that with my co-authors. We have a book coming out on it. So 80% of people with disabilities live in the developing world. A proportionate amount of the experts on the CRPD committee come from the developing world. But both in the text and in the implementation, we're not seeing enough focus. So to give an easy example, 99% of the world's landmines are produced in the global north. 99% are deployed in the global south. There's nothing about landmines as a situation of risk under Article 11. Clean water and sanitation, WASH, right, and hygiene. An issue in parts of the global north, but by and large, the 60% of the world that doesn't have clean water is not in the global. We should be thinking more about that. We should be thinking more about how independent living means something different if you're on the African continent, and the notion of Ubuntu and the notion of community and the notion of family than a Berkeley version of independent living, or even a European version. Adolf Rotzka passed away recently, so I'll mention him, where you take your monthly benefits and you pool them and you pool your resources South Africa right now, it's about the equivalent of $30 a month, right? In Zimbabwe, it's about $15 a month. That's not going very far. So I'd like to see more of a local solutions, local culturally appropriate way of thinking about it. And I'd like to see the official mechanisms recognizing the creativity and innovation from the global South and trying to innovate on.
Yeah, I've noted that all down on almost a vision board. So I appreciate that so much. There's two last questions, if you don't mind, Professor. I see just Cheryl has just put her hand up. Do you have 2 minutes for the last two questions?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Cheryl, you are welcome to go ahead.
Good day, good evening to everybody. You mentioned a bit recently that you were looking, especially in the global south, of more creativity and localized interventions. And it reminded me a lot of when I started my first year in Stellenbosch University, and one of my modules was some sign language, South African Sign Language. And with that department, it was not put onto like a high pedestal like other languages, example, French, English, German, and Afrikaans. And their office was like tucked away in the corner at the back of the university. So, with someone with your expertise and experiences, how would I, as a student of Stellenbosch University, um, help or assist or advocate or um, bring that sort of stigma down for the community of the disabled, is what I'm trying to ask. Yes.
Well, great question. I would begin by reaching out to the allies that you have at Stellenbosch, right? So Leslie Swartz is an incredibly good resource, incredibly good ally, publishes the South African Disability Journal, has been a disability rights advocate for decades, and is thoughtful and sensitive and supportive. Tuli Mandisela, who I was privileged to teach, although I think I learned more from her than she from me, also at Stellenbosch. And she allows me to include disability in her annual conferences and work. So you have some really good people there. And I think if you reach out to them and ask, how can we do more to decrease stigma, to increase inclusion, maybe you can work on some interesting partnerships. They're there. They're wonderful people, and they're there already. So perhaps reach out to them.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Excellent. And then I think the last one just in the chat, Professor, and then I'm going to call it, is Benin just asking clarity on what it means to include people with mental disabilities specifically.
Well, we want to include everybody. Everybody matters. Everybody has worth. Everyone has value. But it would mean if we were running a program, for example, that we would want representation from that sector, and that we would want to ensure, if we were either online or in person, that we had the right level of sensitivity to what stimulus does. Perhaps make sure that we have breaks while we're teaching or doing things. Make sure that there's a safe space for people to excuse themselves and to center themselves or do whatever they need to do to be comfortable. Really, it's no different than other groups.
Yeah, spot on. All right. Thank you. Thank you to everybody who joined today's incredible session. To Professor Stein, obviously really appreciate you taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedule. I will probably be dropping you a mail for a follow-up of sorts. There's so much wealth and knowledge and wisdom there that you've shared with us today. So I just am grateful from my side and obviously from Avi's Mental Health and everyone, just to share big thanks and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. All right. Bye, everyone.